She didn't scream when the judge read the ruling. She didn't cry, didn't fall apart, didn't make a sound that anyone in that courtroom would remember. She sat completely still, hands folded on the table, and she listened. And when it was over, she picked up her purse, walked through the double doors, and stepped out into a May afternoon that felt nothing like spring. Her name was Marlene. She was 43 years old. She had $200 in her purse and a duffel bag in her car. And the man she had spent 9 years of her life building a home with had just walked out of that same courtroom with the house, the car, primary custody of their two daughters, and a lawyer who was already texting on his phone before the door closed behind them. But here is what nobody in that courtroom knew that afternoon. Nobody knew that 2 years later, Marlene's face would appear on a screen inside a room where Douglas was sitting. Nobody knew the look that crossed his face when he saw her. And nobody knew that the moment he decided to fight back against what he saw on that screen would be the single worst decision he ever made in his life. But before we go any further into what happened, we need to go back. Because to understand where Marlene ended up, you have to understand where she started. And you have to understand the man she started it with. Before we go any deeper into this story, we want to hear from you. Drop your city and state in the comments right now. We would love to know where you are watching from. And if you are not subscribed yet, hit that button right now, because this story is just getting started and you do not want to miss a single moment of what comes next. Marlene grew up in Dayton, Ohio, the second of 4 children in a house where love was present but money rarely was. Her mother, Gloria, worked double shifts at an industrial laundry facility for most of Marlene's childhood, pressing other people's clothes and coming home smelling like steam and detergent and something close to exhaustion. Her father, a man named Robert who smiled easy and committed to nothing, left the family when Marlene was 11 years old. He mailed a birthday card the following year with a $10 bill tucked inside and a note that said he was thinking about her. That was the last she heard from him for a very long time. What Marlene learned from watching her mother was a particular kind of discipline. Not the kind that comes from ambition or competition, the kind that comes from necessity, the kind where you stretch a bag of rice further than it should go, and you do not complain about it because complaining does not feed anybody. Gloria taught her daughters to cook before they could reach the stovetop without a step stool. She taught them that a meal made with care meant something to the person eating it, that feeding people was a form of love that did not require an explanation or an occasion. Marlene absorbed all of it. She carried it with her the way some people carry a photograph. She carried it into adulthood, into her first apartment, into every kitchen she would ever stand in for the rest of her life. And she had no idea, sitting in those kitchens as a young woman, that the thing her mother had taught her to do as an act of survival would one day be the thing that saved her. She was 26 years old when she met Douglas at a church potluck in Dayton in the spring of 2003. He was 31. He was tall and well-dressed in the way that reads as intentional rather than accidental. He had a firm handshake and a memory for details, the kind of man who remembered what you ordered the last time you went somewhere together and brought it up again 2 weeks later like it was important. He made you feel seen. He made you feel like the specific, particular person you were rather than just one more woman in a room. Marlene had not had a lot of experience with that feeling. She had grown up watching her mother be made to feel invisible by a man who could not be bothered to stay. She had spent her teenage years and most of her 20s with a low-grade belief, never fully spoken but always present, that the people who were supposed to stay usually left. Douglas felt like the exception to that rule. They dated for a little under 2 years. He proposed in the winter of 2004 on a Thursday evening in his apartment with a ring he had saved for over 6 months to buy. She said yes before he finished the sentence. They married in June of 2005 in a small ceremony at the church where they had met. Marlene wore her mother's earrings. Gloria cried through the entire reception. And Marlene stood in the middle of that day thinking that she had finally built something that would not be taken away. She was wrong about that, but she would not find out for a long time. Their first daughter, Camille, was born in 2007. Their second, Renee, arrived in 2009. Douglas was earning good money in commercial real estate by then, pulling in commissions that made the household comfortable in ways Marlene had never experienced growing up. He suggested, around the time Renee was born, that Marlene stop working. She had been doing part-time administrative work for a dental practice, and Douglas argued, reasonably on the surface, that the cost of childcare for two children barely justified her income. He would handle the finances. She would handle the home and the girls. It made sense on paper. It made sense the way a lot of things make sense when you are in the early years of a marriage, and the person saying them is someone you trust completely. Marlene stopped working. She did not think much about what that meant at the time. She was raising two daughters and running a household, and she was good at both. She had her mother's cooking and her mother's discipline, and she poured both of them into the life she was building inside that house. And for a few years from the outside, it looked like it was working. But something was shifting inside the walls of that house in a way that was difficult to name at first. It started small enough that Marlene would later struggle to identify exactly when it began. A comment at dinner about the way she had styled her hair. A remark in front of his friends about how Marlene did not really understand the financial side of things, said with a laugh that everyone returned except her. A conversation about visiting her sister Patricia that ended with Douglas, explaining why this particular weekend was not ideal, and then the next weekend was not ideal either, and gradually the weekends when it was ideal became fewer and further apart. He stopped asking for her opinion on household decisions around 2013. He began framing it as efficiency. He knew the accounts, he understood the numbers, he would handle it. And Marlene, who had never had access to abundant money in her life, and had no particular reason to distrust the man who had promised to stay, let him handle it. This is what researchers and family law professionals who study financial abuse describe as one of the most effective and least visible forms of control inside a marriage. According to experts who specialize in domestic financial abuse, this kind of arrangement strips a person of economic identity so gradually that the person inside it often cannot locate the moment it became something other than a practical arrangement. It begins with convenience and ends with dependency. By the time Marlene realized how complete Douglas's control over their finances had become, she had not had her own bank account in 6 years. She did not know the login to their primary checking account. She did not know the name of their investment broker. She had a household allowance that Douglas transferred to a debit card at the beginning of each month, and that was the full extent of her financial access to a marriage that had been generating significant income for over a decade. She would try, in the years after everything fell apart, to explain what that feels like from the inside. She would describe it as something like standing in a house where the walls keep getting closer, but the movement is slow enough that you keep telling yourself the room is the same size it always was. You keep telling yourself this is just how things are. You keep telling yourself that the version of your life you remember from the early years was the real one, and what is happening now is a temporary adjustment. You keep telling yourself the man you married is still in there somewhere. And every time you think about leaving, there is the question of how, because you have no money of your own, because your name is not on the accounts, because the children are in school and enrolled in activities and have a house they call home, because your mother raised you to be someone who does not quit, because the word for what is happening to you is a word you do not let yourself use yet. By 2016, Marlene was spending most of her days inside a house that felt nothing like home. Douglas was increasingly absent in the evenings, explaining it as work obligations that she had no way to verify and no framework to question. The household allowance had been reduced twice in the previous 2 years without explanation. When she asked about it, he told her she was spending carelessly and that he was correcting it. She was not spending carelessly. She had a spreadsheet on her laptop where she tracked every dollar of the monthly allowance, a habit she had developed from watching her mother stretch thin resources across 4 children. She knew exactly where every dollar went. But Douglas's accounting of reality had, over years of repetition, become the one that carried weight in that house. And Marlene's accounting, even when documented, even when precise, was the one that got dismissed. She stayed. For 3 more years, she stayed. In the spring of 2019, on an afternoon in late March when the girls were at school and Douglas was at work, Marlene was clearing out a shelf in the home office to make space for Renee's growing collection of school projects. The office was Douglas's domain, and she rarely went in there. But the shelf needed clearing, and she had reached the point in her week where small, manageable tasks were the only ones she could face. She was moving binders when a manila folder slid out from between two of them and landed on the floor at her feet. She picked it up. She opened it without thinking much about it, assuming it was something household-related, a warranty or an insurance document. It was not a warranty. It was not an insurance document. It was a set of financial statements for accounts she had never seen before. Account numbers she did not recognize. Transfers going back more than 4 years, steady and incremental, moving money out of what she had understood to be their shared financial life into somewhere else entirely. She sat down on the floor of that office. She did not stand back up for 40 minutes. She did not cry. She just read every page, and then she read them again. She did not say anything that evening. She did not say anything the next day or the day after that. She waited. She waited the way someone waits when they understand that the thing they are about to do cannot be undone, and they need to be certain before they do it. She called her sister Patricia from the bathroom with the water running on the fourth night. She told her what she had found. Patricia said 3 words before Marlene had finished her second sentence. She said, "Take pictures. Everything." Marlene went back into that office the next morning while Douglas was at work, and she photographed every page in that folder. She photographed other documents she had never thought to look at before, documents that had been sitting in plain sight for years in a filing cabinet she had assumed contained things that were not her concern. She sent the photographs to an encrypted folder on a cloud account Douglas did not know she had created. And then she went back to the kitchen and made the girls their after-school snack and said nothing. She filed for divorce 6 weeks later. What Douglas did in the weeks following that filing is something that family law professionals who reviewed the case described as textbook litigation, abuse. He hired one of the most expensive family law attorneys in the county, a man named Gerald Watts, who had a reputation for strategy that opponents described as exhausting and relentless. Within days of the filing, Douglas had frozen the one joint account that Marlene still had partial access to. He submitted an affidavit to the court, claiming that Marlene had exhibited signs of emotional instability over a prolonged period and was not equipped to serve as primary parent. He listed specific incidents, described in language that made ordinary moments of stress sound clinical and concerning. Moments that Marlene recognized as having occurred, but that had been stripped of all context in the telling. A hard conversation about the girls' school schedules reframed as an episode. A disagreement about money reframed as erratic behavior. The documentation was meticulous, and the framing was precise, and it had the weight of a man who had been quietly preparing it for longer than the divorce had been filed. He brought in witnesses, 2 of them, both from their church congregation. The first was a man who had known Douglas since college. The second was a woman named Sandra, who had been Marlene's closest friend for 11 years. Sandra testified that she had observed Marlene behave in ways that she found concerning. She described 2 specific incidents, both of which Marlene later said were real events taken entirely out of the context in which they had happened. Marlene sat in that courtroom and listened to her friend of 11 years describe her to a judge in a language that did not resemble the person she knew herself to be. She did not allow herself to react. She sat very still and she listened, and she told herself to remember every detail of what she was hearing and why she was hearing it. The divorce proceedings lasted 14 months. When the ruling came, it came quickly once the final arguments were submitted in a single session on a Thursday morning in May of 2020. Douglas was awarded the house. He was awarded primary use of the family vehicle. He was awarded primary physical custody of Camille, who was 12, and Renee, who was 10. Marlene was granted supervised visitation on alternating Saturdays for a period of 3 hours each session, to be conducted with a court-appointed monitor present. She was ordered to pay child support in the amount of $200 per month, beginning 60 days from the date of the ruling. Despite having no current income, no job history for the previous 11 years, and no financial assets of her own, she walked out of that courthouse into a warm May afternoon. She had $200 in her purse. She had a duffel bag of clothes in the back seat of her 2003 Honda Civic, a car that had been titled in her name only because it predated the marriage, and Douglas had never bothered to have it transferred. She drove to a Walmart parking lot approximately 3 miles from the courthouse, and she sat there until 11:47 that night because she had nowhere else to go. And this is where the story that everyone thinks they know actually begins. Because what happened in that parking lot in the next 2 hours was not grief. It was not despair. Marlene would say later that she allowed herself 20 minutes of something that felt close to falling apart. 20 minutes where the full weight of the previous 14 months, the previous several years, the previous decade sat on her chest and made it difficult to breathe. She gave herself 20 minutes, and then she opened the glove compartment, found a gas station receipt and a pen, turned the receipt over, and started writing. Not a list of grievances, not a letter to Douglas or to Sandra or to any judge or attorney, a list of what she still had. She wrote it in a gas station parking lot at midnight on the back of a receipt. She had a valid driver's license. She had a car that ran. She had her sister Patricia, who lived 38 miles away and had been calling her every hour since the ruling. She had a phone with 14 days left on the prepaid plan. She had the $200, and she had something that could not be listed on a financial statement or transferred into a hidden account or submitted as evidence in a courtroom. She had her mother's hands. She had 43 years of watching someone survive, and she had a memory of standing in a kitchen at age 8, watching Gloria turn almost nothing into something that made 4 children feel full and cared for and loved. She sat in that parking lot until midnight. Then she called Patricia and said she was coming. She slept on Patricia's couch for the first 3 nights. Patricia worked the early shift at a medical supply warehouse and left the house by 5:30 each morning. Marlene would lie awake after she left and stare at the ceiling and make calculations in her head. She applied for jobs that first week, anything she could find within driving distance, retail positions, administrative roles, cleaning services. She submitted 17 applications in 9 days. She heard back from 4 of them. Of those 4, 2 said she was overqualified. 1 did not move forward after the phone screen without explanation. 1 offered her a part-time position at a garden supply store at $11 an hour, 20 hours a week. She accepted it. She worked the first shift on a Tuesday and spent the drive home calculating that at that rate, it would take her 7 months to save enough to cover first and last month's rent on the cheapest apartment she had found online, assuming she spent nothing on food or gas. She sat in Patricia's driveway and did the math 3 times. Each time it came out the same way. It was during that second week at Patricia's house that Marlene began driving. She had time between shifts, and she was restless in the way that people are restless when their mind will not slow down. And she drove the streets of the town and the surrounding area the way some people walk when they are thinking. She drove past the downtown farmers market, which operated Thursday through Saturday in a parking structure adjacent to a cluster of office buildings. She noticed that the foot traffic around those buildings on Thursday and Friday mornings was consistent and heavy. She noticed that the nearest lunch option was a sandwich chain 4 blocks away. She noticed that neither of the 2 food trucks she occasionally saw parked near the market operated before 10 in the morning, and that neither of them served anything that resembled a hot, full breakfast. She drove that route on 3 consecutive mornings that week and made notes on her phone each time. She was thinking the way her mother had taught her to think about a kitchen. What do people need that they are not getting? What can you make from what you have? What does it cost and what will people pay and what is left over after? On the 9th day at Patricia's house, she found a listing online for a used commercial food service cart. It was listed at $175. It needed a deep cleaning, and one of its 2 burners had a faulty ignition that the seller described as fixable. Marlene drove 40 minutes to look at it on a Saturday morning. She walked around it twice and crouched down and looked at the burner and pressed her hand flat against the stainless surface to check for warping and asked the seller 3 specific questions about the propane connection. She bought it for $175. She spent the remaining $25 on her first round of supplies. She drove it back on a trailer she borrowed from one of Patricia's neighbors and spent the rest of that weekend cleaning it until the stainless steel reflected her face back at her. She fixed the burner herself with a part she found at a hardware store for $6, which she counted separately from the 25 because she found it in the cup holder of her car, and technically it had already been spent. She named the cart after her daughters. She called it Cammy and Ray's. She set up for the first time on a Thursday morning, positioned at the edge of the farmer's market lot with the best angle to catch foot traffic from the office park. She served 6 items: a breakfast sandwich on a toasted roll with egg and sharp cheddar and a choice of meat, a biscuit plate with gravy, a cup of grits with butter and optional add-ons, a sweet potato hash with onions and smoked paprika, a side of sausage that was made from a seasoning blend Marlene had inherited from Gloria, and coffee, which she sourced from a local roaster, and served in cups she had negotiated a discount on by agreeing to display their branding. She arrived at 5:45 that first Thursday to set up. She was ready to serve by 6:30. She sold 11 plates before 9 o'clock. She made $74. She drove back to Patricia's that afternoon with $74 in a Ziploc bag on the passenger seat, and she sat in the car in the driveway for a long time before she went inside. Not because $74 was enough. It was nowhere near enough. But because $74 from 11 plates served out of a cart she bought for $175 was a number that could be multiplied. It was a beginning, and Marlene had not had a beginning in a very long time. The next Thursday, she sold 19 plates. The Thursday after that, 31. By the end of July, she was selling out of her primary inventory by 10:30 each morning on Thursdays and Fridays. Word was moving the way it moves in communities of working people who feel that most of the world is not designed with them in mind. Someone tells a coworker. The coworker tells her sister. The sister comes the following Thursday with 2 of her friends. Those friends tell people at their office. And what spreads is not just the name of the cart or the address or the hours. What spreads is the feeling of the food, the feeling of eating something made carefully, made with intention, made the way a person makes a meal when they understand that the person eating it has been up since before dawn and will not sit down again until after dark. Marlene understood that feeling because she was that person. She had been that person her whole life. By September of 2020, 4 months after the night in the parking lot, she had opened a small business checking account. She had paid her first month of child support on time and in full. She had moved out of Patricia's couch and into a 1-bedroom apartment with a kitchen large enough to do prep work. She had hired part-time help, a 19-year-old woman named Deja, who had grown up 2 streets over from the farmer's market and needed work and was, as Marlene would say years later, the fastest learner she had ever encountered. And she had quietly begun meeting with a family law attorney named Carol about the possibility of modifying the custody arrangement. Carol had a small practice and a reputation in the local family law community for taking cases on payment plans when she believed in the situation. She believed in this one. She asked Marlene to document everything and to keep documenting it and to not stop. Marlene documented everything. She kept every receipt, every sales record, every tax filing, every child support payment confirmation. She kept a log on her phone of every communication with Douglas regarding the girls. She screenshotted every text, every email, every interaction that passed between them. She did not do this in anger. She did it the way her mother had kept receipts from the laundry facility, the way a person keeps records when they know that their word alone will never be enough in a room where someone else controls the narrative. She had learned that lesson 14 months inside a courtroom. She did not intend to need to learn it again. In the winter of 2020, something began happening with the supervised visitation sessions that Marlene could not immediately explain. She would arrive at the agreed location on the alternating Saturday at the agreed time and find a note from the court monitor stating that the session had been canceled due to a scheduling conflict. It happened on the first Saturday in December. It happened on the third Saturday in January. It happened again in February. 3 consecutive sessions canceled, which meant 6 weeks of no contact with her daughters. Camille was 12. Renee was 10. They were being told, by the absence of their mother on those Saturdays, that she was not showing up. Marlene knew her daughters well enough to know what that silence would feel like to them. She knew what it would feel like because she had been 11 years old when her own father stopped showing up, and she had spent 30 years carrying the specific weight of that. When Carol's office investigated the canceled sessions, they found something that Carol described in writing to the opposing counsel as either an administrative error or a deliberate obstruction of court-ordered visitation. The cancellations had not originated from the monitor's scheduling office. They had been requested through a clerical misdirection that traced back to communications involving Douglas's attorney. The documentation was ambiguous enough that it could not be definitively proven as intentional in that moment. But it was preserved. Everything was preserved. And it joined the growing file that Carol was building with the patience and precision of someone who understood that a case like this is not one in one motion. It is one across dozens of small documented moments over a long period of time. Meanwhile, Cammie and Ray's was growing in ways that Marlene had not planned for and barely had the operational capacity to manage. She had begun posting on social media in the fall of 2020, not promotional content in the way most small businesses post, but simply photographs of what she was making and short descriptions of where to find her. The posts were unpolished and specific, and people responded to them the way people respond to something that feels real rather than marketed. By the spring of 2021, she had accumulated a following of several thousand people, most of them women, most of them in the 40 to 65 age range, most of them who responded in the comments not just about the food, but about what the cart represented to them. They wrote things like, "I needed to see this today." They wrote things like, "You remind me of my grandmother's kitchen." They wrote things like, "I have been watching you grow this, and I just want you to know it matters." Marlene read every comment. She responded to most of them. She understood, in a way that a more experienced marketer might have articulated differently but not more accurately, that what she was selling was not breakfast food. It was proof. Proof that a particular kind of person could build something from a particular kind of nothing. In the summer of 2021, a local journalist named Teresa was working on a feature for a regional lifestyle publication about small businesses run by women that had launched or expanded during the pandemic. She had heard about Cammie and Ray's from 3 different sources in 1 week, which she described later as the kind of sign that a journalist stops ignoring after the second time. She reached out to Marlene through the social media account. Marlene agreed to speak with her. Teresa spent a Thursday morning at the cart, standing off to the side, watching Marlene work. She watched her move through the space the way someone moves when they have memorized every inch of it, every angle of reach, every second of timing. She watched the way Marlene spoke to the people who came to the cart, the brief exchanges that were not small talk, but something more like acknowledgement, like she was letting each person know they had been seen. Teresa asked questions when the line slowed down. She asked about the food, about the menu, about the sourcing. And then, between 2 orders, she looked at the name painted on the side of the cart and asked Marlene who Cammie and Ray were. Marlene stopped what she was doing. She set down the spatula, and she told her, not all of it, not the full 14 months in a courtroom, not the photographs on the office floor, not the canceled Saturday sessions, not the 11 years of a friendship handed over to testify against her. Just enough, just the shape of it. She said she had 2 daughters she was fighting to get back to. She said she named the cart after them so she would never forget what she was building it for. She said she cooked the way her mother had taught her, because when everything else was taken, what you know how to do with your hands cannot be repossessed. Teresa wrote those last 16 words down exactly as Marlene said them. She would use them in the piece. The article ran in August of 2021. It was titled, "She Started with $200 and 2 Names She Couldn't Let Go Of." It was roughly 1,200 words and accompanied by a photograph of Marlene standing in front of the cart in the early morning light, one hand resting on the stainless steel counter, looking directly into the camera. Within 72 hours of publication, the article had been shared tens of thousands of times online. The comment section beneath the shared posts filled with women who wrote some version of the same thing. They wrote, "This is my story." They wrote, "I am sitting in my car reading this and I cannot stop." They wrote, "Someone needs to make this into something bigger because the world needs to see this woman." Someone did. 3 weeks after the article ran, Marlene received a phone call from a production coordinator at a media company based in New York. They were putting together a segment for a nationally broadcast morning television program, a recurring feature about small business owners who had rebuilt their lives after significant personal loss. They had found the article. They wanted Marlene. The segment would involve a crew coming to her location, filming her at the cart, and conducting an interview. It would air during a morning broadcast slot with a viewership that Marlene, when she looked it up that evening, found difficult to fully comprehend. She said yes. She said it before she hung up the phone. She sat on the edge of her bed in her one-bedroom apartment for a long time after that call, and she thought about a parking lot and a receipt and a pen that she had found in her glove compartment. She thought about $74 in a Ziploc bag on a passenger seat. She thought about Camille and Renee and the particular silence of a Saturday morning when 3 hours of supervised visitation gets replaced with a note that says scheduling conflict. She thought about all of it. And then she got up and went into the kitchen and started prepping for Thursday. The segment filmed in October of 2021 on a Thursday morning at the cart. The crew arrived before sunrise. They filmed the setup, the first customers, the food, the way Marlene moved through the space. They sat her down for a formal interview against a clean background with a lavalier microphone clipped to her collar. She wore a simple navy shirt. Her hair was pulled back the way it always was when she was working. She spoke clearly and without notes about what the last 2 years had been and what she had built and what she was still fighting for. She said her daughter's names once, briefly, near the end of the interview, and she did not elaborate beyond it. She did not need to. The segment was edited to approximately 4.5 minutes and aired on a Tuesday morning in November of 2021 during a broadcast slot that reached a national audience. Douglas watched it. He was at his office when it aired. A colleague, a woman named Helen who handled his administrative scheduling and had no knowledge of his personal history with Marlene, had seen the segment promoted on the network's social media the evening before. She sent him a link that morning with a message that said, "Have you seen this? This woman's story is incredible. She's from here." Douglas opened the link, and there was Marlene, on a screen in his office on a Tuesday morning, standing in front of a cart she had built with $200 in a county where he still held the deed to a house in primary custody of 2 daughters, and the belief until that exact moment that the woman he had left in a parking lot with a duffel bag had stayed there. She had not stayed there. She was on a nationally broadcast morning program in a navy shirt with her name on a cart behind her, and she was talking about building something from nothing, and her eyes were clear and her voice was steady. And the person watching the segment in his office on a Tuesday morning at a desk with a view of the city below him was the one who did not look steady. The people who were in the office that day would later say that Douglas closed his door shortly after opening the link and did not come out for the rest of the morning. What Douglas did in the 48 hours after watching that segment is something that Carol, Marlene's attorney, later described in a deposition as the single most consequential error he made in the entire sequence of this case. He contacted Marlene directly, in writing through a message that bypassed his own attorney. The message stated that the television segment constituted defamation of his professional character and personal reputation, and that he was demanding she take steps to have it removed from any platform where it had been reshared. He used language that Carol would later read aloud in a hearing and describe as threatening and retaliatory. His attorney, within 24 hours, sent a formal cease and desist letter to Marlene's address and to the production company that had filmed the segment. The production company's legal team responded in a single paragraph, noting that the segment contained no defamatory content and that no action would be taken. But by then, the cease and desist letter was sitting in Carol's file, and it had joined a growing collection of documents that Carol had been building for 18 months with exactly this kind of moment in mind. Carol filed for an emergency custody review within 72 hours of receiving the cease and desist. She submitted the letter as Exhibit A. She submitted the records of the 3 canceled supervised visitation sessions and the documentation of the clerical misdirection that had preceded them. She submitted 22 months of Marlene's business financial records, organized chronologically, showing consistent income, consistent child support payments made on time and in full, consistent documentation of every communication with Douglas and his attorney. She submitted a character letter from Deja, who wrote 3 pages in her own hand describing what she had observed in Marlene over 19 months of working alongside her. She submitted letters from 14 members of the community, including 3 regular customers who had been coming to Cami and Ray's since the first Thursday it opened, 2 local business owners who had worked in proximity to the cart, and the journalist Teresa, who wrote about what she had witnessed on that October morning when the crew was filming. She submitted a letter from a family counselor who had met with Marlene 6 times over the previous year and who wrote in precise clinical language about Marlene's emotional stability, her parenting orientation, and her sustained and consistent focus on the well-being of her children throughout the period of separation. The emergency custody review was granted within a week of the filing. The hearing was scheduled for January of 2022. Marlene sat across a courtroom from Douglas for the second time. This time, the table between them felt different. Not because she was angrier. She was not angrier. She had not spent 22 months in anger. Anger is expensive, and she had learned early to spend carefully. The difference was the file in Carol's hands. The difference was the 22 months of documentation sitting in organized folders. The difference was that the man sitting across from her had made a series of decisions over a long period of time that he had made with the assumption that Marlene would not document them, would not preserve them, would not have the resources or the resilience to build a case from them. He had made those decisions based on a version of Marlene that had existed, briefly and painfully, in the parking lot of a Walmart at 11:47 on a May night in 2020. He had not updated his understanding of who she was in the time since. That was the most expensive mistake of all. The hearing lasted 2 days. The judge reviewed the full submission of documents. Both attorneys made their final arguments, and the court recessed to consider its ruling. The ruling came down 6 weeks later, on a Thursday afternoon. Carol called Marlene at 2:14 in the afternoon. Marlene was at the cart, finishing the end of a Friday service, wiping down the counter. Her phone buzzed in her apron pocket. She stepped to the side and answered it. Primary physical custody was transferred to Marlene, effective 30 days from the date of the ruling. Douglas was granted visitation on alternating weekends, with a monitor present for a period of 6 months to be reviewed at the next scheduled hearing. Marlene stood at the side of her cart on a Thursday afternoon in February of 2022 with her hand pressed flat on the stainless steel counter, and she listened to Carol read the ruling, and she did not say anything for a long time. Carol waited. And then Marlene said, "Okay." She said it the way someone says a word when the word is not big enough for what it is carrying, but it is the only word available. She said it, and then she finished wiping down the counter, and she started breaking down the cart the way she did every Thursday and Friday at the end of service, methodical and careful and precise, because the cart still needed to be packed and the supplies still needed to be stored, and Thursday would come again next week. She picked up Camille and Renee for their first overnight 30 days later. Camille was 14. Renee was 12. Marlene drove to Douglas's house at the scheduled pickup time and waited in the car and watched her daughters come out the front door with their bags. Renee ran. Camille walked fast and then ran too. Marlene got out of the car and held both of them in the driveway for a long time without saying anything. They drove back to the apartment, and that evening before they ate, Renee asked if they could have breakfast food for dinner. Marlene stood in her kitchen on a February evening with both of her daughters sitting at her kitchen table, and she made what she always made: the biscuit plate, the sweet potato hash, the sausage with her mother's seasoning blend, the same food she had been making on Thursday mornings in front of strangers who had become regulars, who had become something close to community. She made it in her own kitchen, with her own daughters at the table, and nobody spoke much because nobody needed to. The food said what it had always said. It said, "You are here, and I made this for you, and I am not going anywhere." By the end of 2022, Cami and Ray's had expanded to a second cart operating on a different part of the city on different days. Marlene had 3 employees in addition to Deja, who had by that point been promoted to operations manager for 2 days of the week and was taking classes in small business administration at the local community college, tuition partially covered by Marlene. Marlene had been invited to speak at a statewide women's entrepreneurship summit held in October of that year. She stood at a podium in a room with 400 women, and she said something that was quoted in two separate regional publications in the days that followed. She said, "I did not build this to get back at anyone. I built it because my daughters needed to see what it looks like when you do not quit." The room was silent for a moment after she said it. Then it was not silent at all. Douglas's commercial real estate business contracted significantly in 2022. A forensic financial review, initiated as part of the custody modification proceedings, had flagged the irregularities in the accounts Marlene had discovered in that Manila folder in the spring of 2019. The review was referred to an independent auditor. As of the time this story was compiled, the outcome of that audit remains in progress. Douglas has not contacted Marlene since the cease and desist letter and its consequences. Now here is what this story is actually about. And it is not the food cart. It is not the custody ruling or the morning television segment or the article with the photograph of a woman in a navy shirt standing in early morning light with her hand on a stainless steel counter. It is not the cease and desist letter or the forensic audit or the second cart or the entrepreneurship summit. All of those things happened and all of them matter. But none of them is the center of the story. The center of the story is a parking lot. A 2003 Honda Civic with a cracked dashboard. A gas station receipt turned over to its blank side. A pen found in the glove compartment. And a woman who gave herself 20 minutes to fall apart and then decided that the inventory of what she still had was more useful than the inventory of what had been taken. That is where this story was won. Not in a courtroom. Not on a television screen. In a parking lot at midnight by a woman who had been taught by her mother. In a house that was often short on money but never short on discipline, that a meal made with care means something to the person eating it. That feeding people is a form of love that does not require an explanation. That what you know how to do with your hands cannot be repossessed. Marlene did not defeat Douglas because she was stronger or smarter or more resourceful than the circumstances she was handed. She outlasted him. She outdocumented him. She outdisciplined him. She did it one Thursday at a time, $74 at a time, one child support payment at a time, one preserved screenshot at a time, one carefully logged Saturday cancellation at a time. She did it the way her mother had done the thing her mother had to do, without applause and without an audience. Until suddenly, one Tuesday morning in November, there was an audience, and the person watching from a desk with a city view below him found out that the woman he had left in a parking lot had not stayed in the parking lot, not even close. Here is what I want to know from you. Think about the moment in this story where the direction changed. Not the TV segment, not the custody ruling. Was it the parking lot and the receipt and the 20 minutes she gave herself? Was it the Manila folder on the office floor? Was it the day she named that cart Cammy and Ray's? Or was it something else entirely, something you noticed that I did not name? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one, and I mean that. And tell me where you are watching from. Drop your city and your state. Before we go any further, I want to know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. If this story reached you today, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Not someone who needs to be entertained. Someone who needs to be reminded that the parking lot is not the end of the story. It is where some stories begin. There is another story coming that I have been sitting on for weeks. I will tell you right now that the ending is one I did not see coming, and neither will you. Subscribe and stay close.